Miss Lincoln.
This tape in, this plugged in.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Politics has become one of our most abused and neglected professions. Yet it is this profession, it is these politicians who make the great decisions of war and peace, prosperity and recession, comma, the decision whether we look to the future or the past, period.
The voice of John F. Kennedy, dictating an autobiography he was never able to complete. Part of the private record, now released, that allows us to bring the 35th President of the United States into sharp focus. The material, phone logs, medical records, the most secret meetings of his White House staff reveal a flawed giant who dominated the times through which he passed.
There's some report that the Russian ships were not going to stop. We were going to have to sink them.
Governor, this is the President speaking. We've got to get somebody up there now to get order and stop the firing and the shooting. Then you and I will talk on the phone about Meredith.
Oh, Doctor, I wonder if you could send up a little extra medication.
I mean, he's a silly man. I wouldn't have him running a cat house. I don't know. We may get into the invasion business before many days are out.
It adds up to a story of a remarkable man who helped shape a remarkable era. Kennedy's legacy is defined in part by the manner of his passing.
The sound of the muffled drums sweeps in melancholy waves over the hushed throng, a hush broken only by a stifled sob, a murmured prayer. Down this avenue of
those haunting images that have left a permanent scar on the nation's psyche, memories that refuse to fade.
An eternal flame is lighted before the grave by Mrs. Kennedy, the first such memorial to burn in Arlington Cemetery.
After the assassination, Kennedy's presidency rose to a mythical status, his actual performance in office judged in part on how he died. But the words that are etched into stone around his grave at Arlington reflect not the way his life ended, but rather an especially hazardous period in American history, days of challenge and danger.
You, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear.
I, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear
that you will faithfully execute the
It all began on a cold January morning in 1961.
Preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
Preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
So help you God.
So help me God.
The task facing the incoming president was daunting. A world in crisis, the rhetoric of war rising to a crescendo. As he embarked, Kennedy told the nation it was entering what he called its hour of maximum danger.
To those nations who would make themselves our adversary, we offer not a pledge, but a request that both sides begin anew the quest for peace. Before the dark powers of destruction unleashed by science engulf all humanity in planned or accidental self-destruction.
There was the sense that we were on the brink of an uncontrollable situation. Neither the Americans nor the Soviets wanted a war. That's absolutely clear from the evidence. But neither side was confident that in the final analysis they could control the start of a war.
Kennedy was the first president in more than 100 years to come to power when the United States was vulnerable to attack. We were at war everywhere in the world. At least that's the way we saw it, and certainly that's the way John Kennedy saw it.
Kennedy intended the speech to inspire Americans to become involved in the political process. Young Americans who for too long had viewed politics as irrelevant to their lives.
Now the trumpet summons us again, not as a call to bear arms, though arms we need, not as a call to battle, though in battle we are, but a call to bear the burden of a long twilight struggle, year in and year out, rejoicing in hope, patient in tribulation, a struggle against the common enemies of man, tyranny, poverty, disease, and war itself.
It sort of captured the essence of, I thought, my brother's appeal, and that was he was giving the American people, and really people around the world that were listening, not a set of promises, but really a set of challenges. It seemed to me that that was very much a part of the essential aspect of the speech, and one of the reasons that it still resonates.
That January day, America was inaugurating more than a man. It was embracing a family. The patriarch, Joe Kennedy, had been the driving force, having set the moral, political, and financial foundation for his sons. This day was a fulfillment of his driving ambition, the transformation of this Irish Catholic family to an American dynasty. The country had entrusted its future to a 43-year-old, the youngest man ever elected to the presidency. But there was much they didn't know about Jack Kennedy, deep secrets that might have prevented his election in the first place.
I'm not sure he felt he could have been elected if people knew how sick he was. And secondly, he was promoting the new frontier. He was supposed to be a vigorous guy, and to find out that he had this level of medical problem would have negated, I think, to some extent, the image that they were portraying.
The extent of Kennedy's physical problems put his drive and determination in perspective.
The most important thing about John Kennedy was that he thought he was going to die young, and he could not wait his turn. And he didn't wait his turn. He got the presidency at a very young age because he didn't think he was going to be around at an old age. And how he did that and how he got through those days made no difference to him.
It wasn't until 2003, 40 years after Kennedy's death, that independent doctors were allowed to review all his medical records. They found a cover-up dating back to Kennedy's first run for public office in 1946. At that time, the apparently vigorous candidate was battling colitis, an intestinal disease often resulting in ulcers and chronic diarrhea.
They didn't know how to treat colitis in those days. In 1937, steroids became available. His father, a very wealthy man, one of the richest men in America, was able to afford to buy these drugs, and they began giving him the steroids to treat the colitis. And this reigned in the colitis in part, but it also caused him to have osteoporosis of the lower back, the lumbar spine. It also caused the shutdown of his adrenal glands and brought on the Addison's disease.
Addison's can be life-threatening. It shuts down the body's ability to produce certain hormones that control many vital organs. Kennedy's symptoms included tiring easily and increased susceptibility to infections. He also found it hard to bounce back from the numerous operations he'd had to endure. Throughout his public career, the Kennedy family downplayed his ailments. However, in 1954, cameras filmed his admission to the hospital for serious back surgery. At the time, doctors inserted a steel plate into his back, which had to be removed a year later when the site became infected. But the public wasn't told that the problems persisted and dominated his daily life. They weren't told he'd been administered last rites 3 times in the 1950s. Not told about the emergency medication packs his father sent to U.S. embassies in every foreign country his son was to visit.
Senator John Kennedy of Massachusetts.
He has, coming up to 56, colitis, he has prostatitis, urethritis, sinusitis, and these are the things that he is hospitalized for between 55 and 57. He can't go up a staircase directly the way someone with normal flexibility can. He can barely turn over in bed at night. He can't pull the shoe and sock on his left foot because of his back malady. The man must have had an extraordinarily high threshold to deal with pain.
To survive the rigors of a presidential race, Kennedy had sought out Max Jacobson, a controversial New York doctor. He was known as Dr. Feelgood among the Hollywood stars who used him. Kennedy specifically sent for him before the first televised debate against Richard Nixon. His relaxed, confident performance was in part a result of drugs administered by Dr. Jacobson.
My guess is, and Robert Kennedy certainly told me this as well, that John Kennedy was in pain every day of his life. So that he lived with that. He obviously had functioned at a very, very high level. He looked like a god. So what did it matter that his insides were eating themselves up? It only mattered, I think, internally, in the sense that it drove him to be more careless and more reckless than a man who expected to live into his 70s or 80s might be.
Several times during the 1960 campaign, there had been speculation that Kennedy might have Addison's disease and that it might affect his performance in office. Every time, the family denied the ailment and insisted that he was in excellent shape.
How do I view it retrospectively? As a cover-up, as something which they consistently, energetically worked to hide from the public.
Kennedy also hid the fact that his marriage was hardly the picture-perfect union captured in the photo shoots with Life photographers. There were strains caused by the 12-year age gap, but also the rumors that suggested that Jack was unfaithful.
He told me, I had an interview in the campaign, and he said that it had been tough in those early years of the marriage. I didn't understand her, and she didn't understand me, and the difficulty was rather severe in that time, and they considered separation.
By the end of the 1950s, the world was slipping into a crisis with the Soviets that many feared would lead inexorably toward war. In his own recollections, recorded in the Oval Office, Kennedy described how he had grown increasingly alarmed at what he perceived as American weakness in confronting the challenge of communist expansion, concerns only a president could address.
During my years in the Senate, I've come to understand that the presidency is the ultimate source of action, period. The Senate is not. All of the things that you become interested in doing, the president can do, and the Senate cannot, particularly in the area of foreign policy.
For Kennedy, every day was a gift, and he didn't want to waste a moment. And that was the attitude he brought to the presidency. Every minute that you're president is a gift, and no single minute can be wasted.
None of the family secrets were evident on Inauguration Day 1961. Americans were enthralled by the spectacle of their new first family.
The youngest couple ever to be in the White House, the best looking certainly, probably the very best dressed, and the richest among other things. So I mean, you had royalty, even though it was perceived as a presidency, it was truly an American royalty.
To combat the challenges he knew would lie ahead, Kennedy selected an impressive cabinet. The best and the brightest, they were called, these men of the new frontier. Interestingly, Kennedy hardly knew any of them, not Dean Rusk, the rather bland academic from Georgia who was to be his Secretary of State, and certainly not the liberal Republican, president of the Ford Corporation, who Kennedy picked for the Pentagon, Robert S. McNamara.
Initially, I thought he didn't know what the hell he was doing, and I told him that I wasn't qualified to be secretary. First, I was offered Secretary of Treasury, and I said, my God, I've been an industrialist, president of Ford, invested lots of money, but I'm not an expert on Wall Street finance or Treasury operation, no. And then he offered Secretary of Defense, and I said, well, look, I was in the U.S. Army for 3 years, but that in World War II, but that didn't qualify me to be a Secretary of Defense, so I'm not qualified. He said, Bob, there isn't any school for presidents either, which I thought was a wonderful comment.
His first presidential decision was to reappoint the FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover, a powerful and controversial figure many of Kennedy's supporters wanted to see removed. But Jack Kennedy knew Hoover had damaging information on him. An FBI file had been opened on him in 1942, when Kennedy began a relationship with a woman believed to be a Nazi spy. Now, 20 years later, he appointed his brother Bobby to be the Attorney General, with responsibility for monitoring the FBI director.
Bobby becoming Attorney General was partly self-protection, that with Hoover out there, with J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, the president needed an attorney general who was in position above Hoover to keep Hoover under control. This is consistent with Kennedy family self-protection. Joe Kennedy understood this. Joe Kennedy had been courting J. Edgar Hoover for years, had even offered him a job as his own chief of security. So there was a shrewd kind of covering your own flanks by putting Bobby in as Attorney General.
The conventional wisdom was that Bobby would be his brother's alter ego. But Jack kept most people at a distance, even his brother.
The person who was probably close to him, Bobby Kennedy, his brother, never was invited upstairs for a meal while John Kennedy was in the White House, and Bobby had great resentment about that. But Kennedy kept people in their place, and Bobby's place wasn't the second floor, it was the first floor.
Most incoming presidents have the benefit of a honeymoon period, but for Kennedy, world crisis bore down on the administration from day one. In Moscow, the wily Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev had announced his intention to support the expansion of Soviet communism into the Third World, to challenge American spheres of influence from Vietnam to Cuba. In response, Kennedy called for a massive increase in defense spending. 10 days into his term, he delivered this grim assessment in his State of the Union address.
No man entering upon this office could fail to be staggered upon learning, even in this brief 10-day period, the harsh enormities of the trials through which we must pass in the next 4 years. Each day the crises multiply. Each day their solution grows more difficult. Each day we draw nearer the hour of maximum danger as weapons spread and hostile forces grow stronger.
Within 9 weeks, Kennedy would face his first Cold War crisis. For the new administration, it would prove to be an unmitigated disaster. Few in the president's inner circle saw it coming. 90 days into the term, they were all still filled with the euphoria of simply making it to the White House.
A new president is still feeling rather heady. He's won the presidency. He's on top. He's got the magic touch. He can't lose. That's a very dangerous feeling to have when you're president.
Dangerous because it can result in poor judgment. In Kennedy's case, it did. He'd been presented with a plan targeting Fidel Castro and Cuba, a plan that had seemed so plausible. It had been hatched by the CIA and endorsed by President Eisenhower in his last months in office. A covert operation that would remove Castro, restore American influence over the Caribbean, and project Kennedy as a man of action and accomplishment.
This young president was presented with the recommendations of the chiefs and the CIA and President Eisenhower's plan to go ahead with this, I'll call it harebrained scheme, to overthrow Castro.
This footage of Kennedy going into the cabinet room to greet the Joint Chiefs on the afternoon of February 20th was taken by filmmaker Robert Drew. He'd been given unprecedented access to capture a day at the White House for a television documentary.
They'll have an amphibious landing on the beach, and then tomorrow they have a strike exercise, carrier strike exercise. Then they will be taken down to run to Panama.
How many countries are represented?
All but Cuba.
Those remarks were not included in the original broadcast. What you just heard was part of a classified briefing dealing with secret military exercises being conducted in preparation for a possible invasion of Cuba. Over the next 2 months, Kennedy would listen intently as invasion advocates stressed the importance of following through with the plan Eisenhower had endorsed. Kennedy felt the generals were testing him, trying to determine whether he had the courage to be an effective commander-in-chief.
I think it's terribly important to remember that he was a lieutenant in the Naval Reserves, and he was talking to admirals with so much gold on there, and generals and all of this, that he was impressed by that. And they were naturally unimpressed with him.
The CIA had devised 2 separate schemes to be run simultaneously. In Central America, it was training 1,500 Cuban exiles to invade Cuba and spark an uprising. At the same time, the CIA was trying to kill Castro. Robert Mayhew, a former senior FBI agent, was recruited to coordinate the assassination.
I met with Chef Edwards and Jim O'Connell, who were my contacts within the CIA. They told me that they were planning on a program to assassinate Fidel Castro, and that they knew I had a contact with the mafia. They felt that they were the logical ones to take on this kind of assignment.
But did Kennedy know about the CIA plans to assassinate Castro, and that they'd recruited known mafia figures to carry out the assignment?
We don't know for sure. What we do know is that Kennedy had a personal relationship with Richard Bissell. And Richard Bissell was the action officer for these Cuban operations in the beginning. Did Bissell tell him about the assassination plots? He was too smart a man to talk details. Did he signal to Kennedy that we're looking at all options to get rid of this thorn in our sides out there in Cuba? I think so.
By the time Kennedy was inaugurated, Mayhew had set up at the Fontainebleau Hotel in Miami and recruited two leading mafia figures to assist in the assassination of Castro, Sam Giancana from Chicago and Johnny Roselli from Miami.
The first hope was that it could be done by assassination via firearms. Giancana reported back that he could not find anyone who had the tenacity or the willingness to get involved in such a situation. At which time the CIA came up with the plan of a poison pill. Giancana reported subsequently that his contact at the last minute had, I believe it was a female, because he claimed that she had lost her courage to go through with the plan.
By the beginning of April, CIA officials were giving up hope that Castro's death would precede the invasion. They nevertheless pressed Kennedy to launch the attack. The military supported the mission. Kennedy and his new team felt reluctant to challenge the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
We've only been there less than 90 days. Many of us didn't know very much about it, were inexperienced in such situations. In any event, weren't enthusiastic about it. Dean Rusk and I, in particular, had questions in our mind, but we didn't say no. Not a single one of President Kennedy's members of the executive branch advised against it.
Kennedy was insistent that the CIA role be hidden. The assassination and the landing of the exiles had to be seen as a local uprising. Cubans overthrowing Castro, not the U.S. removing a communist threat. Anything else would invite Soviet intervention against American interests elsewhere.
He then fell prey to some of the plan's advocates, accepted the plan, accepted it full of cautions and ambivalence. The cautions and ambivalence took a plan that was already very risky and problematical and doomed it to almost certain failure.
On April 15th, 8 B-26s, flying from a CIA-controlled airstrip in Nicaragua, bombed 3 Cuban airfields. But the surprise attack was no surprise at all to Castro. The outlines of the supposedly secret plan had been known in Havana for weeks. Castro ordered air batteries to be manned around the city. He stifled opposition by throwing 20,000 people in prison. The CIA's plan was doomed before the first troops landed at the Bay of Pigs. For 2 days, the exiles were pinned down along the Bay of Pigs, battling against overwhelming odds. They had been promised American air cover, but it never arrived. They'd also been told that if they encountered strong resistance from Castro's forces, they should head to the mountains and regroup. The CIA had failed to mention that the mountains were 80 miles away across a mosquito-infested swamp. The operation was later to be described by the CIA as a perfectly executed failure.
Lose, we never expected to lose. We knew it was going to be hard, but knowing the power of the United States, how can you expect a country that has never been defeated, have never backed a losing cause, was going to do to us what they did.
He held himself responsible for this because he knew that throughout the process, he could have said no. At no point did anybody set in motion anything that didn't have presidential authorization. His mistake was not to have had the self-confidence to have seen through the woolliness, the weakness of the plan that was presented to him.
In one last pitch to get Kennedy to join the fight, Pentagon officials revealed to the president that they had sent the carrier USS Essex to the Caribbean with the capability of wiping out the Cuban Air Force. They assumed Kennedy would never accept defeat in Cuba. Throughout the night of April 18th, Kennedy met with his advisors. The decision: there would be no assistance given to the Cuban brigade.
He said, I'm not going to take this nation to war with Cuba. And the brigade was lost. I think he was right.
The commander of our battalion got us together, and he said we had communications with brigade commander. This is over. It's been an honor for me to serve with you. You are on your own.
And I saw the people saying, Chino, let's get out of here. We've been betrayed. We're going to get into the boats and get out of here. This is the biggest betrayal in the history of Cuba. Let's get out of here.
More than 150 men died at the Bay of Pigs. For Jack Kennedy, this was the first time he had faced political defeat, and he didn't like it.
After the Bay of Pigs, one night I was in with him, and he said, here we were, 50 of the brightest men, the best men, the most experienced men in the world, and we all sat around and we said, gosh, isn't this great? Isn't this a wonderful plan? And then he said, 5 minutes after it began to fall apart, we all looked at ourselves and said, how could we have been so stupid?
Throughout the crisis, Kennedy was feeling the strain. Medical records during this period show an increased level of medication to combat anxiety and pain. On top of this, the president was devising techniques to disguise how much it was affecting him.
There were episodes where, sitting at a table at meetings, he had to have aides stationed at both shoulders because he couldn't lean forward to get papers. So to make certain that it didn't look as if he couldn't lean forward, the aide would lift the paper and put it in front of him. There were periods when he had to use a stand-up desk because he couldn't sit down. And there were periods when, before he could go into conferences, he'd have to get injected in his back.
Meanwhile, newspapers were reporting that this was a CIA operation. But for 2 days, the White House stonewalled. Finally, Kennedy made a public statement, accepting responsibility for the debacle.
There's an old saying that victory has 100 fathers and defeat is an orphan. Further statements, detailed discussions are not to conceal responsibility, because I'm the responsible officer of the government.
It was a terrible blow. My God, it was a terrible blow. But just imagine the first major thing you have to get up is to do in front of the American people is to accept blame for a disaster.
After he made the speech where he accepted full responsibility, and he was walking back through the White House with my brother Bob, and my brother Jack said, what do we do now, Bobby? And Bobby said, let's call my father. Maybe he can find something good to say. And when they called him, my father said, this was one of your best speeches. Americans can understand people making mistakes, even presidents of the United States. And the fact that you've stated this and accepted responsibility, they will respond to you.
1 week after the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy's approval rating rose to 83% in a Gallup poll. Ruefully, Kennedy told Ted Sorensen, the worse I screw up, the higher go my numbers. In the aftermath of the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy felt he had been trapped by senior military officers who had treated him with thinly disguised contempt.
We took a long walk on the circular drive that's behind the White House, during which time he blamed himself, cursed himself for relying on experts. He said, I got where I am by not relying on experts. Why did I do it this time? He just cursed himself out, that the experts had misled him, and he wanted some generalists to sit in from that on. He wanted Robert Kennedy, his brother, and me, probably the two men in government who knew him best, who knew his mind, who knew and shared his goals, his objectives, and wanted to protect his interests.
Robert Kennedy in particular would become the principal protector of his brother's interests, political and personal.
They were absolutely in tune. The two of them. I mean, you didn't often hear completed sentences. You knew by a nod and a wink and a smile or a frown or a comment exactly what the other one was thinking between them. And there was a complete trust. My brother Bob would always give the unvarnished truth, and he'd give the bad news as well as the good news.
Soon after the Bay of Pigs, a bizarre sequence of events threatened to ensnare the president in a sex scandal. During the campaign, Jack Kennedy had gone to Las Vegas to meet Frank Sinatra and other members of the Rat Pack, including Kennedy's brother-in-law, Peter Lawford. While staying at the Sands Hotel, he met Judith Campbell, with whom he began an affair. Kennedy didn't know that Campbell was also the girlfriend of Sam Giancana, one of the mob bosses the CIA had recruited to kill Castro. Campbell began regularly visiting Kennedy at the White House. When Hoover found out, he warned Bobby that his brother was keeping dangerous company. And he added, the information would be kept on file.
If we had known that Kennedy was going to bed with the woman who was Sam Giancana's mistress, we might have done something. But who knew that? Kennedy knew it, maybe his brother, but J. Edgar Hoover knew it. And if J. Edgar Hoover wanted it out, he would have come to us. Then we'd have gone to our superiors and said, can we use it? J. Edgar Hoover never leaked it to us. Why? Because that's the power J. Edgar Hoover had, not just on Kennedy, but a lot of congressmen over the years. The man was a blackmail artist.
Campbell wasn't Kennedy's only affair. There were rumors of a relationship with actress Marilyn Monroe. White House staffers whispered about an affair with Pamela Turner, Jackie's press secretary. There was talk of naked swims in the newly renovated White House pool with two secretaries nicknamed Fiddle and Faddle. And finally, there was an affair with a White House intern, which only surfaced 40 years later.
He lived life as a race against boredom. And whether it was women, danger, excitement, he literally wanted to be president of the United States because that's the most exciting job in the world.
Kennedy believed his private life was off limits, that his friends in the press corps would respect his right to privacy so long as it didn't affect his ability to perform his job.
Politicians could have pretty wild sex lives and nobody would write about it because that was the unwritten rule. So Jack Kennedy was living in a bubble or in a world where it was relatively safe to do this sort of thing.
President Kennedy could not have survived in today's political atmosphere. All the things, all the illusions that he was able to create could not survive in this highly intense, cynical, skeptical, aggressive and abrasive climate that we live in today.
Over the years, the revelations have tarnished Kennedy's image.
That was a reckless side of him, and that was a stupid side, really. I'm disappointed. I don't understand a man who could be so sensitive and understanding of world problems and domestic politics, and he would do this. The lack of personal discipline there when he had it in so many other areas, I don't get it. I still don't.
But during his lifetime, the rumors were contained. What Americans saw of Kennedy was an image cultivated through the emerging power of television.
All of these images are carefully choreographed to convey to the American public this, in many ways, illusion of vigor and strength and of this ideal young American family.
A bond was developing with the public that went beyond political loyalty. Americans liked their new first family and began treating them with the sort of adulation normally reserved for movie stars. Jack loved it, but Jackie was finding it intrusive and suffocating. She had moved into the White House just 6 weeks after giving birth to John. Any hopes that she could slip into the shadows quickly evaporated. The nation was obsessed with all aspects of her life. Nothing seemed too inconsequential.
The mail came in by the sackfuls. Every mother who had a newborn wrote Mrs. Kennedy and asked what she was doing about her newborn, son John. What formula was he eating? How was his gas? How easily did he burp? I mean, every personal question was asked. And we would answer back and say, little John is doing very well, and Mrs. Kennedy appreciates your interest, but she really can't go into those personal details, and she's sure you'll understand.
But the press was harder to brush off. For the first time, newspapers assigned reporters to cover the First Lady. What Jackie thought and did made news, and she was having difficulty adjusting to life under the constant watch of the Secret Service.
I was over at the White House with Jackie a couple of times, and she was very negative about the White House. And she told me, she said, Hugh, it's just like a hotel. She says, you can't have any privacy here. You look down every corridor, there's a Secret Service person lurking around. I got the feeling that she just didn't like living there.
But it was more serious than simple dislike. 3 months after John's birth, Jackie was showing symptoms of depression. She took the children and left Washington for the family compound in Palm Beach, Florida. Even Kennedy's closest staffers were not aware that the president had called Dr. Jacobson, the doctor who had quietly treated him during the campaign and since. On May 12th, Jacobson flew to Florida to treat Jackie. That evening, she reported that her migraine was gone. Among the inner circle, only Bobby Kennedy appears to have been concerned about Jacobson's role. Not with Jackie, but with the president.
Robert Kennedy became worried about what is the president actually taking? What the hell is this he's injecting into his own legs every day? What kind of pills is he taking? So Bobby basically raided his medicine chest and took some of the vials in there and took them out to the FBI lab to have them analyzed. What he found out was that, at least in this case, the president was taking amphetamines, was taking speed. It was not illegal then, it was only restricted as a drug, but Bobby found out enough to know that this stuff can kill you, and it killed a lot of people, and he confronted his brother about it, and Jack Kennedy said, I don't give a damn if it's horse piss. It makes me feel better, and I need that. Now get the hell out of here.
By the spring of 1961, Kennedy was to find himself dependent on Jacobson in a way his other doctors, and certainly the country, never knew. On the afternoon of May 16th, Kennedy arrived in Canada. For the new president, this was more than a ceremonial visit. Canadian Prime Minister John Diefenbaker was blocking American attempts to deploy nuclear weapons on Canadian soil and was voicing doubts about the new administration's Cold War rhetoric. Kennedy went before the Canadian Parliament to appeal to the Canadian people for support.
For it is clear that no free nation can stand alone to meet the threat of those who make themselves our adversaries, that no free nation can retain any illusions about the nature of the threat, and that no free nation can remain indifferent to the steady erosion of freedom around the globe.
What followed was one of those instantly forgettable moments of any official visit, a tree planting outside Government House that didn't even make the evening news. Kennedy, without showing it, seriously aggravated his chronic back problem and would leave Canada in agony. At Andrews Air Force Base, there was no hiding the crutches or the forklift truck that had to lower the president down to the ground. The health issue that had been covered up during the campaign was now more serious. Coping with the pain would now consume a significant part of Kennedy's daily life.
He would spend sometimes hours in bathtubs, 5 showers, hot showers a day, steaming hot, because the hydrotherapy was, it eased the back pain, loosened the muscles, I guess. And he was told, of course, in 1961, that if he didn't strengthen his back and abdominal muscles by exercise, there was a very good chance he'd end up in a wheelchair before his presidential term was over.
None of this was new to the family, who had watched Kennedy deal with back pain all his adult life.
I think it was something that was common, a common occurrence. I mean, often it would appear when least expected. I mean, he's planting a tree in Canada putting the shovel down, and boom, off goes his back for a period of two and a half weeks. He picks up a briefcase just getting out of a car, boom, off this goes. So it was sort of the constant catching and then an enormous discomfort. I mean, we just would remember the time he'd come home for the weekend, and rather than sort of being around at dinner tables or something, he'd go to bed for two or 3 days to rest a back or so like that. So this was something that was very real.
Kennedy's White House had a myriad of medical specialists on hand to treat the president's symptoms. One of Kennedy's personal doctors, Janet Travell, was appointed White House physician. But from the beginning, the care of the president was not in the hands of a single professional.
Kennedy's health care is very complicated. Janet Travell was the White House physician who treated him on a regular basis. His aides brought in Admiral Berkeley and Dr. Hans Krauss and other physicians because they thought that Dr. Travell was overtreating him. While this was going on, Max Jacobson, for several years, was treating him on an outside basis. And to this day, nobody has any idea what he was using.
There was to be no opportunity for the president to fully recover from his back injury. Ahead was one of the most important overseas trips of his entire presidency, a journey to Paris to meet Charles de Gaulle, and then to Vienna to meet Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. On the eve of the summit, Kennedy went before the Congress to warn of the dangers and urge Americans to be prepared for the unthinkable, a nuclear war.
The possibilities of an irrational attack, a miscalculation, an accidental war, or a war of escalation in which the stakes by each side gradually increase to the point of maximum danger, which cannot be either foreseen or deterred. It is on this basis that civil defense can be readily justifiable.
But he also wanted to respond to a Soviet propaganda coup.
Hail to the hero of the cosmos.
The first man in space was a Russian cosmonaut, Yuri Gagarin. A triumph, Khrushchev said, that proved communism, not capitalism, would lead exploration into the new frontier. 3 weeks later, America answered the challenge. Alan Shepard became the first American in space. So on May 25th, Kennedy used his appearance before the Congress to describe the boldest scientific challenge since the Manhattan Project.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish.
Having presented American scientists with this challenge, Kennedy felt he had regained the initiative over the Soviets. He was now ready to head to Europe, but not before a brief weekend at the Cape, where his mother became concerned about his obvious discomfort.
We had had dinner with my brother and my mother and father, and he was just leaving to fly over to. And my mother said, "Aren't you look a little sore?" My brother said, "Well, it's bothering me a little bit. It's bothering me." And my mother said, "Well, you wait right down here." And she went up and got a back plaster and put one of those back plasters on him. And when he arrived over there, he called Mother and said, "That's the best answer that I've had."
The presidential party arrived in Paris on May 31st, 1961. Jackie, who spoke fluent French, was returning to the city she'd known as a student. Kennedy came intending to charm President Charles de Gaulle, to flatter a man renowned for his inflated ego. It was a triumphant welcome. Crowds lined the entire 10-mile ride from the airport into the center of Paris, where the motorcade was met by plumed cavalry of La Garde Républicaine.
Something changed. And she said, "You know, this can be pretty good." this business of being first lady, you know, if it's used right. And I think she may have signed on in Paris.
I do not think it altogether inappropriate to introduce myself to this audience. I am the man who accompanied Jacqueline Kennedy to Paris, and I've enjoyed it.
Kennedy was there to reassure de Gaulle that America's security treaties meant something. The French had long feared that America would not defend Western Europe from a Soviet attack.
De Gaulle said, "You will not save us. If the Soviets, if their empire marches towards Western Europe, you're not going to use nuclear weapons." And Kennedy had to say, I think once or twice, "Yes, we will. Yes, we will."
For a man who sought the presidency to contain the threat of nuclear war, it was ironic that he would find himself in Paris, assuring de Gaulle that he was willing to commit a first strike. The French warned Kennedy that they'd been dealing with Khrushchev for 6 years, and the young American president should give no hint of weakness, especially on the status of Berlin.
They said, look, Vienna is going to be a psychological testing ground. Khrushchev is coming there to see how resolved you are. Don't give an inch, don't vacillate, don't show weakness, don't talk about any interim agreements on Berlin, do not budge.
The city, divided between East and West at the end of World War II, stood 90 miles inside communist East Germany. Hundreds of thousands had been flooding across Berlin's open borders, escaping communism and threatening the survival of the East German regime. Kennedy assured the French president he was ready for his encounter with Nikita Khrushchev, the surly Soviet premier. He wasn't. The Soviet-American summit was scheduled to begin in Vienna on June 3, 1961. Khrushchev and his entourage came by train, traveling west from Moscow through the countries of the Warsaw Pact. He appeared congenial, relaxed, and confident.
Here you have Khrushchev, a man of peasant background, who's been working in the upper leadership of the Soviet Union for a quarter century. Deeply involved in the Stalin regime and in Stalin's crimes, a person who has personally ordered and witnessed many, many executions.
But behind the smiles and disarming manner, Khrushchev was worried. He knew he had to extract some kind of concession from Kennedy on Berlin, or risk the collapse of the East German communist government.
Both Kennedy and Khrushchev felt that their part of Berlin and their part of Germany were the #1 dominoes to protect, because if they lost them, they'd lose many others. They both felt that this conflict, this world conflict that dominated the Cold War between democracy and communism, had to be won first of all in Berlin.
Kennedy received a hero's welcome on his way to the American embassy in the heart of Vienna. Once inside, he was met by Dr. Max Jacobson, who was ready with his mix, including amphetamines, to help the president's back pain. Kennedy would receive the medication before each of the 4 sessions planned for the next 2 days. Neither Jacobson nor his medications were being monitored by White House physicians.
They flew him on a separate plane. He was not part of the contingent on Air Force One. He was brought in, so to speak, by stealth. This was hidden from the other physicians.
Khrushchev's Vienna reception was reserved, reflecting curiosity rather than enthusiasm. The American appeared to have the upper hand. The first meeting was held at the American embassy on the afternoon of June 3rd. The youthful Kennedy towered over the squat 67-year-old Khrushchev. Viktor Sukhrudev, Khrushchev's translator, is now the only surviving summit participant.
Neither Khrushchev nor Kennedy had any papers on that coffee table. Nothing. No talking points. Nothing at all. That was the kind of meeting that Vienna was.
Without a structure, the first session meandered until Kennedy made his first mistake. He attempted to debate the merits of the 2 political systems. It opened the door to a monologue from the Soviet leader.
That was Khrushchev's hobby horse. He jumped on it and began a long discourse on the advantages of socialism and eventually communism, on the inevitability of communism overcoming capitalism. It was just the inexorable path of history. That was Khrushchev all over. And of course, that topic got them absolutely nowhere.
That Khrushchev would behave in that kind of crude manner, I think Kennedy would have found shocking. It would have shaken him, and it would have impressed on him the gravity, a sense of the grave danger we were in. So I'm dealing with this guy who is clearly a very strange character indeed, who I plainly will not be able to relate to easily. And I'm dealing with him now on issues that involve the possibility of thermonuclear war.
The first day ended with some agreement over guaranteeing the neutrality of Laos, but the most difficult issue, the status of Berlin, had not been mentioned. That night, there was a formal dinner at the Schönbrunn Palace. Khrushchev arrived in a business suit, rejecting black tie as a symbol of Western decadence. His wife, Nina, decided against wearing makeup. Jackie Kennedy, wearing a dress designed by Oleg Cassini, stole the show.
Even a Bulgarian like Khrushchev would have looked at Jackie with an eye of envy.
There was Nina, looking very dour and like a sack of potatoes in navy blue fabric with a rope tied around her waist. She was very embarrassed to be there, you could tell. She felt very ill at ease. And there was Jackie shimmering like a white fairy goddess. Khrushchev kept looking at her, constantly looking at her.
The next day's meeting was held at the Soviet embassy. Just as Kennedy feared, Khrushchev insisted that he had the right to support wars of liberation in the Third World, especially in Vietnam. Again, the session rambled on for hours until Khrushchev finally came to the point on Berlin. Within 6 months, he intended to sign what he called a peace treaty with the East Germans that would end Allied rights to occupy West Berlin. Kennedy realized this could mean war.
Kennedy certainly signaled to Khrushchev that what he cared about adamantly was West Berlin, and he really laid it down in their summit meeting in Vienna. He drew a line in the sand.
Kennedy warned Khrushchev that the Soviet position threatened world peace, but the Soviet leader seemed unmoved.
He reached that point with Khrushchev where he said, look, if there is a nuclear exchange, 70 million people will be killed in the first 10 minutes. We just can't let that happen. He said, we have got to work this out. And he said, Khrushchev didn't bat an eye. He didn't blink. There wasn't a flicker of any emotion. It was just as if, so what? And then that's when Kennedy ended it and say, well, if that's the case, it's going to be a long, cold winter.
Khrushchev looked confident for the cameras. Kennedy looked grim. Returning inside the Soviet embassy, Khrushchev delivered his assessment to his staff.
Khrushchev said, I recall this very well to this day, he said, my God, I pity the American people if they have that kind of president as their head of state.
I think that he hadn't realized that he was going to run into that stony a wall, and he was started to wonder whether you could do business with that man of any kind, and I think that scared him. It should have. It did.
The last session had been tortuously long for Kennedy. Normally, he didn't sit still for more than a few minutes, but had been pinned down by Khrushchev for 5 hours, long after Dr. Jacobson's injections had worn off.
Kennedy came in, and he had a hat with him, which was rare for him. He slumped down in a couch and put the hat down over his eyes, and Reston said, "How'd it go?" And Kennedy said, "Worst thing in my life." He walked all over me.
When we flew back from London after Vienna, I was on the pool on Air Force One. And about halfway, he summoned me to come up to him. And Kennedy is stripped down to his shorts. And the Navy Corps men are there, putting hot packs on his back. He looked terrible. He was gray with fatigue. I mean, it was the first time in my reporting where I'd seen a president who looked like sometimes I felt, who was so human in flesh, in pure flesh and blood, who looked totally fatigued and really fragile.
On the evening of June 6th, he reported to the American people from the Oval Office.
I went to Vienna to meet the leader of the Soviet Union, Mr. Khrushchev. For 2 days, we met in sober, intensive conversation. And I believe it is my obligation to the people, to the Congress, and to our allies to report on those conversations candidly and publicly. Mr. Khrushchev and I had a very full and frank exchange of views on the major issues that now divide our two countries. I will tell you now that it was a very sober 2 days. There was no discourtesy, no loss of tempers, no threats or ultimatums by either side. No advantage or concession was either gained or given. No major decision was either planned or taken. No spectacular progress was either achieved or pretended. We have wholly different views of right and wrong, of what is an internal affair and what is aggression. And above all, we have wholly different concepts of where the world is and where it is going.
Rarely did he allow his pain to interfere with his performance as president. But journalists remarked that the president seemed tired. Pierre Salinger, the White House press secretary, explained Kennedy's lethargy as jet lag. In reality, Kennedy had arrived back at the White House hardly able to stand.
I do know that when he came back from Vienna, he was in bed in the White House almost continuously for 2 weeks, recovering. And the message was put out that he was analyzing the meeting. But he came back exhausted.
Even the president's staff was kept in the dark, but a few friends were invited to visit. Ben Bradley found the White House Theater had been adapted to deal with the president's personal crisis.
I remember going to the movies with him one night downstairs in the theater of the White House, and he was on a bed. Just couldn't, not even with his feet propped up or anything like that. He was in bed.
It was at this time that Kennedy ordered his secretary, Evelyn Lincoln, to secure all the medical records and release nothing. It's not difficult to see why.
He was on, for most of that period, Lomotil, Metamucil, and Paregoric for his stomach. He was on Transitine, which is an antispasmodic. He was on phenobarbital, which is a muscle relaxant. He was on lidocaine or procaine injections in his back. He was on oral corticosteroids, injected corticosteroids, testosterone to build his muscles up, and Tuinol for sleep. He was also on salt tablets. And he was being, particularly in the first 6 to 9 months, he was being injected on a weekly, sometimes daily basis, 5 to 6 places in his back, just so he could go on.
Only 6 months into his term and confronting his own frailties, Kennedy had a bigger worry. He told friends he feared a nuclear war might be inevitable. He was convinced Khrushchev would make a move on Berlin and that he would have to respond.
One night after Vienna summit, I was in there and it was kind of late and it was a moody night, I must say. And he said, I think there'll probably be a nuclear exchange between the Soviet Union and the United States, probably sooner rather than later. And he said, if I know anything about history, he said, it tells me that these weapons are invented, and then they build up stockpiles, and then somebody uses them. And he said, I think it's probably going to happen with us.
And this was just the beginning of John Kennedy's problems. Kennedy's concerns would have increased if he'd known the confidence the Soviet leadership had felt in light of the Vienna summit. Moscow was convinced the American president would buckle under pressure. From Vietnam to Cuba to Berlin, they intended to seize the initiative. Foreign Minister Gromyko told a meeting of the Central Committee of the Communist Party that the tide of history was running in Moscow's favor.
That phrase that Gromyko uttered during that meeting was, in short, let me say that in Vienna, there was a meeting between a giant and a pygmy.
In the next 14 months, Nikita Khrushchev would twice bring the world to the verge of nuclear war.